Okay, thank you again for attending. I know this is kind of a boring topic, the grant review process, but it is very, very important. Understanding the grant review process and the review criteria is key to preparing a successful and competitive application. The review process varies widely among different sponsors and different agencies. So first I'm going to start off and talk about the basic overview on just like kind of the general view of a review process. And then we're going to take a more specific look at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and NSF, the National Science Foundation, because those are our biggest sponsors. Now, even though each sponsor has its own process, the review criteria is used to evaluate the research grant proposals are based on a similar set of fundamental questions. One, does the research fit within the funder's mission? Will the results of this research fill a gap in knowledge or meet an unmet need? And do the investigators have the skills and resources necessary to carry out the research? Now, each sponsor has specific review criteria in their solicitation, so it's very crucial that you read the solicitation. And I also want to point out that there are other words used to describe the solicitation that other sponsors use, such as funding opportunity announcement, FOA, call for proposals, request for application, RFA. These are all used interchangeably, so you'll hear them throughout the presentation. Some are more specific to NIH and some are more specific to NSF. Other keywords that you'll hear used interchangeably is proposal and application. Again, they're specific to NIH and NSF, so you'll hear us use those words interchangeably as well. So this is a basic review process without talking about a specific sponsor. First, you submit your application. The application is reviewed for compliance and to make sure that it's complete. At this stage, there is potential for your application to be returned without review. I'll talk a little later about some specific examples on how your application or why your application will be returned without review. Then we move into the processing and the initial review. Here, the assignment to the appropriate review process takes place, identification of reviewers, and the reviewers will review and write up their comments, their initial rankings, individually, usually. And then we move into the panel phase. Here, the individuals present their findings or their rankings to a group, and initial ratings usually can be revised at this point, and the panel discusses and summarizes each application. Then we move into the recommendation phase. This is where deciding officials review everything from the reviewers, and they make recommendations of what they think the funding decision should be. And then it moves into the administrative review. The program staff reviews the funding decision. And then the final decision is made and the award is processed, or you'll receive a decline notice. And most sponsors will provide comments and or the summary statements from the reviewers. Again, this is very broad. It's hard to talk about a review process broadly because sponsors have their own process. So I just wanted to kind of give you a general feel of it. These are the main standard types of review. It could be an individual review by subject matter experts. Typically, this is NSF. It could be a group review by subject matter experts. This is also NSF, but it could be NIH. NEH also uses this type. Group review by lay people. This typically is like Department of Education and the Foundation's Board of Directors. And staff review. This is typically agency staff, which could be experts or lay people used by DoD, which is Department of Defense, federal mission agencies, private foundations, maybe industry. Okay, now I'm going to dive in specifically to NIH. So once your application is received, it goes to the Center for Scientific Review, CSR. This is where the manual check for compliance and specific requirements are done. Make sure your application is complete. This is the window where it could be returned without review. Your application will receive a unique identifier number. You as the PI will receive that number, so you want to hold on to that, because if you ever want to ask questions about your application, you'll use that number. And it is assigned to an NIH institute. And it goes to the integrated review group, which is like an umbrella for all the study sections. Then it moves into the study section. And I would like to note at this point that in your NIH application, you actually can request a specific study section if you want. So working with RIT's Sponsored Research Services, SRS, you can let them know if you want to. It's called the PHS assignment form, I believe. So study section is the term that NIH uses. It's also the same as like an NSF panel. So a study section is essentially a panel. Here, the review, your application's reviewed for scientific merit. And the scoring is done here. And this is where the summary sheet is made. This is also the stage where you could receive a just-in-time request. It's called a JIT, J-I-T, where NIH might request more information. Then you move into the institute. Your application moves on to the institute specifically for NIH. They evaluate it for relevance to research priorities that could have been laid out in your solicitation. So again, it is key to read your solicitation. You want to make sure you're addressing what they're looking for. Then we move into the advisory council or board. This is your second level of review. Here they're not looking at scientific review. This is more potential barriers to funding, such as if you have human subjects or animal concerns. Maybe you have a foreign collaborator, or it's a renewal application. And they recommend what action should be taken, whether funding or not funding. And they send their recommendations to the institute director. And the institute director has the final say on if your application is funded. NIH has specific review criteria. The overall impact is the key review outcome. This is based on 5 criterion that I'll go through. It is the main basis for your funding. This is your impact score. So the 5 criterion that your overall impact score is dictated by is the scored review criteria. The first one is significance. Does the project address an important need? How will the project improve scientific knowledge? If it's completed, what methods, technologies, or interventions will improve the field? Kind of what the significance is. The next one is investigator. Is the investigator well suited? If they're an early stage investigator, do they have the experience and training? If they're experienced, do they have an ongoing record of accomplishment? So this is one of the scored criteria. I just want to mention that this is why it is so important you spend time on your bio sketch to show your experience, your training, your accomplishments. I mentioned that because some faculty do the bio sketch at the last minute, so it's not as strong as it could be. So that's an important document here. The third criteria is innovation. Do you have novel theoretical concepts, approaches, methodologies? Next one is approach. Is the overall strategy, methodology, and analysis, is it well reasoned and appropriate to accomplish your specific aims? Matt will go into more detail about the specific aims. And finally, environment. Do you have institutional support? Do you have the right physical resources? Reviewers will see if you listed an experiment that needs a certain piece of equipment, but if you don't have that piece of equipment, how are you going to do that experiment? So you need to make sure that you outline that. So the third item on the list, additional review criteria. Reviewers will use additional criteria determining the scientific merit in providing the overall impact score. However, these do not receive an individual score. Your study timeline. Your protections for human subjects, if you have human subjects. Vertebrate animals. And biohazards. They'll also look if this is a resubmission or renewal application. And finally, the last item, additional review considerations. These are items that do not have a score and they should not be considered in the overall impact score, but they will look at it. This is the select agent document, your resource sharing plan, the budget, and the period of support, like how many years your project is. NIH has a 9-point scale, 1 being exceptional, 9 being poor. So the lower your score, the better. So you can see the categories that it's divided into. And I also want to note that each NIH institute has different pay lines. And the pay lines is the score at what they're currently funding at. And most of the pay lines are on the institute's specific homepage. So it's important to look at that as well. That's the overview on NIH. I'm going to go ahead and move into NSF. This one will go a little bit quicker. I feel NIH is more of an intense review. NSF, your proposal is received. The program officer reviews it to verify it's complete and compliant. This is where your application could be returned without review. The reviewers are selected by the PO based on specific or broad knowledge of the field. Program officers might already know, like based on their own knowledge, certain of a research area, like what reviewers they want to ask. They might look at the references listed in the proposal, and they might just do computer searches for journal articles. And also the reviewer recommendations from the PI, you can include that in your application. Then it moves into the peer review stage. The program officer manages the review panel discussions. They summarize the reviews and communicates with the PI. Program officer then makes a recommendation to the division director. And the division director at NSF makes your final decision on if you're being funded. Just going to quickly talk about the NSF review criteria. I'm sorry, I just want to clarify when I mentioned pay line in case there was some confusion. It's your the score at which the institute is funding or not funding your application. NSF has two broad review criteria: intellectual merit that it encompasses the potential to advance knowledge. And the other main review criteria is broader impact. This is the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes. There are 5 elements that are considered in the review for both of these criteria. So, well, one I said, intellectual merit or the broader impact. What is the potential for the proposed activity relating to those? The second is what extent does the proposed activities suggest and explore original or potentially transformative concepts? Is your plan well reasoned, well organized? And how do you assess success? And fourth, how well qualified is the individual, team, or the institution? And the fifth item is, are there adequate resources available to the PI? Matt will go into more details about this criteria. NSF has a 5 ranking score scale. So here's the scoring for NSF. Then your applications, once they're scored based on the scale, they're divided into 3 categories, which are self-explanatory: highly competitive, competitive, and not competitive. I mentioned earlier that your proposal could be returned without review. I think this is the fear of many PIs. There are common things that happen that I just want to go over, and I also provided how we can avoid those. Not responsive to the sponsor's funding opportunity announcement. In the solicitation, it notes maybe specific goals or something. If you don't address those, then it could be returned without review if it's not a fit for that, not necessarily goals, but topic. I've actually had an application withdrawn because the solicitation, it was NSF, and it talked specifically about what research they wanted. It was very sciencey and it was specifically focused. And I advised the PI that they needed to reach out to the program officer to make sure that that's what they were looking for. They decided not to reach out to the program officer, which is fine. I didn't want to force it, but that application was returned without review because it did not fit in the science-related section of what they were looking for. So avoid that by contacting your program officer. Also, NIH has different solicitations now for clinical trials and not clinical trials. Make sure you apply to the right one. Next, non-compliant or incomplete applications. Examples, you can't use hyperlinks in your proposal. If you do, they'll return it without review because that's viewed upon you trying to circumvent the page limits. Missing sections or documents. Some specific solicitations might be different than the normal sponsor guidelines. They might say you need this additional document, you need this additional letter. Make sure you have the most current solicitation. NIH, if you'll know if you have the right solicitation because in the related notice section, it'll tell you if a newer one has come out. NSF, they don't update their solicitations as often, so you need to go to the specific program page to look for additional information. So avoid that by reaching out to SRS at RIT. You want to work with them well in advance, make sure that they can review everything for you. And lastly, eligibility criteria. Avoid this by working with SRS. It could be eligibility of the institute. It could be eligibility criteria specifically for the PI. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt here. He's going to give you a more in-depth look at NIH and NSF from the reviewer's perspective.
So now we'll be talking about the review process from a reviewer's perspective. I myself have been a reviewer for NSF. I think it's been about 7 or 8 times now on different committees for the review process. And for NIH, I review annually, so I typically work with them. Now things are hosted through Zoom, but I've worked very frequently with them. And so I'd like to share a little bit about my experience of the review process from a review perspective to maybe help you understand a little bit more about the process from an internal view. So I'll be starting with NIH. So NIH's reviews are based on what we call study sections. And so typically what I do is I do sign this. It looks more like review panel because NIH and NSF, they have similar names, but they're not quite exactly the same. So there's different themes, and I've listed a few of the most common. The first being LCOM, which is language and communication. That's one study section. And I work pretty frequently on that committee. There's also audiology. And then the third being cognition and perception, which we label CP. And I think that there's over 100 different reviewers, review panels or study sections in that area. So each review panel has a team of individuals that will follow the review process. And there are 2 different kinds of reviewers. The first is called chartered members. The second kind is called ad hoc members. With the chartered members, They are consistent reviewers. They typically do not exit the process, and they'll stay for about 4-year term. And about 3 times a year, they'll go to review various applications for funding. The ad hoc members, those are individuals that we call or are invited to help just sort of on a per diem basis when we acknowledge that the charter members have some areas of gaps or weaknesses. We invite ad hocs who might be experts in those areas just to come for that temporary review on that application or two. And then they'll help with the process in that way. So those are the 2 types of members. It's really important, as Lori mentioned, when you submit your application to NIH, it's crucial that you proofread and you take a look at everything that they want and make sure that it aligns with your application. Their requirements or criteria align with your application. If you go to the NIH webpage, you can actually see a list of the chartered members right there on the webpage. You have access to that. So all of their names are listed there. And you might notice that there are certain kinds of people that might understand some of your work a little bit better than others. And what's important is when you submit your application, you are allowed to ask for certain people on your review panel. So again, if you find yourself finds that someone has familiarity with your topic, it might be good to choose them. And the Center for Scientific Review, they will allow you to have a preference in chartered members or reviewers just to make sure that you're picking the right people who know your stuff. It's also important to understand that NIH and program officers and institutes, those are words that we associate with NIH, but the words that we use for NS are different. So they are 2 completely different institutes, and they have differing processes in that way. So we call NIH, it's a program officer, and a program official at NIH. So it will go to a review panel, and I've sat on many review panels, and sometimes they'll happen at the same time. The program officer actually has to decide which review they'll be going to. And typically they will pick panels that they have the most familiarity with. And so they might be choosing one over the other. And if your application is in the area that was not chosen, but the program officer is in a different meeting, then you miss out. So what's most important here is to contact the program officer and to chat a little bit with them about why maybe your grant was denied. You can perhaps understand what went wrong in the process. Maybe you didn't get that reviewer that you wanted, but it's most important to be in touch and contact with the officer if you have questions about the panel process. And that's the interpreter's apology. It was supposed to be study section, not review panel, so my apologies for that. But now moving on to NSF review, where we do actually call them review panels. I've listed 2 examples of panels that we have with associated programs, one being DEV, Developmental and Learning Sciences, and then LING being linguistics. And so again, different panels include different repertoires of expertise. And NSF, they don't have chartered members. That's not something that they utilize. The panels do tend to be ad hoc most of the time. So that is one thing that's different. And you'll never know who's involved in the ad hoc panel for NSF with your application because of the nature of being ad hoc. NIH, again, they have a list of reviewers. You're able to take a look at that. You're able to chat for the study section to see who you might like to be in your section and who you might like to have review your application. But in NSF, that's not an option that's available because it's, again, ad hoc. And so you won't know who's in the room. But with NIH, you could potentially. As I mentioned with NIH, you're able to have an opportunity to choose reviewers, whereas NSF, you're not. And it's really kind of the program determines the panel for NSF. And we want to have program officers that have something to do with those programs. So for example, if your research is based around linguistics, you'll be sent to that review panel, particularly with linguistics. So it's important to make sure that your application matches those, the scope for the program itself that you're applying to receive funding from. My experience with NSF program officers, they do tend to be very helpful with that. And so I think you can email them with an idea or a question and see what they have to say and see if they're interested and if you could be a good match. I've done that myself before, and the respondent might tell me, no, it's not a good match, but there's other programs that they may be able to refer you to or recommend that would be indeed aligned with what you're requesting. And so that's good information to know. That is something you can take advantage of. And NIH tends to be a little less helpful. Now, once your application physically is ready to be reviewed and we have the people together, let's talk about what happens. So we'll start again with NIH. The first step is called triage. And basically that just means that the applicants are split into various groups, two really. One group would be, you know, this is worth the discussion to review their application, whereas others might be deemed not fitting. And so they would be neglected. And so of course you naturally want to be in the group that's reviewed, but how do you get your application there? So the triage process itself is based on the initial review from 3 people. Each application that NIH sends they will send it to the 3 reviewers. We have number 1, number 2, and number 3, again, for the reviewers. And those individuals are the people who will be reading the application very in depth in its entirety nearly. And typically one application, the RO1 application, an early researcher, is typically 1 to 2 full days of work that it will take to review and comment and think of things for consideration and type up the feedback. Those 3 reviewers expend a lot of time on those applications individually. They will then score the application based on 5 criteria that Lori had already mentioned in the beginning. So I won't go over it again, but we assign 1 number, which is called the overall impact score. So 1 number from each reviewer will be assigned to the application, 1 score. The last part of that process, once it's done, we have the SRO, which is the scientific review officer. That individual then will collect aggregate all of the scores and numbers and average everything out based on those 3 reviewers, and will average a score for each grant between the 3. And so again, you'll have your average impact score based on that average total score. So again, some are, the top 50% are discussed and considered, and the bottom 50% are not. And the process itself depends on what kind of grant you're applying for in the first place. So for example, for study sections for NIH, there's 4 main categories. The first is RO1 application, which is for very, very new researchers, new early stage investigators. They're early in their career, they have not yet done a lot of scholarly work. That's the first level. The second level is RO1, which is for experienced investigators, so people who have already received grants. We have an R15 as well, which is for institutes that actually don't have a lot of funding or support from NIH at large. They're able to apply for an R15 grant. And then lastly, we have an R21, which is a development and exploration grant. In each of the 4 categories that I've mentioned, the applications are ranked based on their average overall impact score that was collected again from those 3 reviewers. And if you're in the top 50%, they will discuss further into the next process for review of your application. If you're in that bottom 50%, you will not be discussed. So the feedback will be reviewed again from each of the 3 reviewers, or you will have feedback from each of the 3 reviewers. But you won't have a summary because there's nothing to discuss if you're in that bottom 50%. So now the study section discussion. What does it look like when you're actually in the room having discussions? It's a full room of individuals or a Zoom room, living virtually now. And the last time I went for a review panel or a study section, it was indeed virtually on Zoom, but there were about 30 reviewers in the room who were able to review the applications that were sent to us. Now, all of those individuals are able to vote on your application. So thinking about 30, that's a decently good number. So what happens is we've got those 4 categories again. So we start with the RO1s, the early investigators. And we take that collective amount of applications and we go through and figure out which we rank them, not best from worst or worst from best and start in some order, but randomly rank them. And we have 2 minutes to start. We oversee the applications. And remember, we had those 3 individuals who had already ranked and scored, but now we've got 30 individuals and we only have 2 minutes to do it. And so thinking about all of the work that you put in, and it's about 3 months of time to get your proposal ready and set, and a person reads it for 2 minutes. That's all they have access to. And so basically what they're going to read to begin with is your abstract and also your specific aims. Lori had mentioned that I would be going into that more right now. So again, we've just got 2 minutes for those sections. Once they're done, the reviewer will rank based on their whatever score they think for your overall impact score. Again, we've got that 1 through 9, 1 being the best, 9 being the worst. And then after that, there's a few minutes to summarize the research from the application and also have comments, feedback that may impact the score from the reviewers at this time. Finally, at the end, there's about 5 minutes for open discussion between all of the reviewers. So everyone in the room is able to participate in a discussion. If people have questions for clarification or any comments or any opinions or considerations, they're able to utilize this time to speak, to express them. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about how the score is figured out.
So now the committee chair will summarize the discussion and then ask the reviewers, the initial 3 reviewers, for their final score. And at times they can change their score after they go through that process. So reviewer 1, 2, and 3 will provide their final impact score to everyone in the room. And at this point, we now transition to a range of some examples where reviewer 1 might say, I rated this application at a 2. The next one might say a 3. And then the third reviewer, let's say, rates it at a 5. So we have 3 different scores within a range between 2 through 5. So everyone, all 30 members in the room, will now assign a score within that range between 2 and 5. That's the range that was given by the initial 3 evaluators. So if you want to give something higher or lower, you have to announce that to the rest of the group. It's called giving or ruling out outside the range of those initial scores. And at the end, you receive an average score from all the reviewers in the room. And that becomes your final impact score. So if you could get let's say a 2.3, that would be incredible. A 1.4 is outstanding. A 5.2 might be in the middle of the line where you might not receive support. So that's essentially the outcome provided by all the reviewers in the room. And it's really important that you write a very clear and strong specific aims. And your abstract is a clear representation of what you're going to be doing. Because most individuals, like I was saying, only have those 2 sections to read with a very limited amount of time. So it's very important to know that those reviewers who, the initial 3 reviewers actually spent the time to thoroughly look through your application. So, and they're doing it in the midst of all the other assignments that they have, whether they're instructing other students or working with other faculty or doing their full-time day job. These review sessions, typically there are 8 grants that they need to review. So if you think of it, that might be 8 to 12 days additional work on top of what they're actually doing throughout the year. So when they're reviewing this, you could picture someone reviewing it at the end of the day over a glass of wine. And so when you think about that context, let that influence how you write out your abstract and specific aims. Very important to know that reviewers, the initial 3 reviewers and their initial scores, like I provided, their initial scores, and then by the time they announce their final scores in front of the group might change, but typically it doesn't change much. So when we think about that range that's provided for people to actually then vote based on that range that they provide, can really make or break the application. And it's very important that it's indicative of the time that reviewers 1, 2, and 3 spent with your overall application, and hoping that it rates the highest impact. And each application, like I was mentioning, could be about 150 pages in length. And we get into so much detail going page by page, reviewing it thoroughly. And it's so important to, again, impress those initial 3 reviewers. So when we think about this, let's make the reviewer's job easier. And here's some categories about ways that we can focus. And one of those things is to focus on your specific aims page. Again, because this is what reviewers read first. So what's the intent of the application? What are my goals of what I want to see accomplished, and how do I achieve them? And that's 1 page, but most people, I know they say, write that page first in the process. All your resources and efforts should be dedicated to that 1 page for your specific aims. And make sure that that is satisfactory, and then spend the rest of your time, the next 15 pages, elaborating on the project description. It's also so important to help the reviewers by basically telling them, where is your significance, where is your innovation, and where your rigor lies within this research project. These 3 components need to be clearly defined for those reviewers. The innovation in this application is, you fill in the blanks. And the reviewer can, as they're going through, they can take those comments into their own summary or notes for their review. And most reviewers are for the most part, very positive people. They know how much effort and time, the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes, that you invest into the application process. They actually want to like and support your work. So think about that as you're going through the process, and let's make sure we don't disappoint them. So keep that in mind. And it's also really important to be very specific, which means don't drop the details. Include all of those important components in the application, which again can be another big mistake when people try to propose doing so much work, and when they're describing what they're doing and why and how, it actually becomes superficial, where there's not enough substance in that description. what we would recommend is to do a thorough amount between all the sections. So if someone in some applications, if they have 8 or 9 specific aims that they want to address, I've never seen those all funded or even discussed, because that's too much to actually take place realistically. Most RO1s have maybe 2 or 3 specific aims at most. So keep that in mind as well, and let that let you really narrow down how those specific aims are going to be kept through. And again, try to keep that under 15 pages. Don't submit 14 pages if you have 15 pages worth of information. Use all the space that's allowed. Reviewers do take note of that. There are some common responses and commonly heard phrases within the room, and I'd like to take a moment for you to read the slide before I go into this. Some examples of some things that we hear over and over again in the review sections are very common phrases, and what their examples are shown on the slide. Let's transition to the NSF review process. The NSF panels typically are a lot smaller compared to the NIH study sections that were just outlined. And at times there are maybe 1 or 2 programs that have separate panels. And if a program receives a lot of applications or proposals that one year, they might establish 3 different panels to address depending on volume. And in my experience, for the NSF review process, there's a lot more collaboration, discussion, and interaction at large, which will then cause different changes in scores. So, but there's a lot more information exchange and dialogue around that to see if that proposal increases its probability or lowers its probability of getting funded. So it actually stems from that dialogue that takes place. One important note is that when you get a review for your application, this review is actually not written for you. So to give you an example for the NSF process, the NSF panel might have a very specific goal to make a recommendation to the program officer. And when we are discussing in that, using that time, we might say that we recommend 3 proposals that we would categorize as highly competitive and should be funded. And the reviewers are responsible to provide justification to the program official's decision. So for example, if a linguistic panel was discussing over an application, maybe the program officer would say, you know, I want you to give me a list of only 4 proposals that are worth considering in this category. And that team might go back and decide on the 4 highly competitive applications and pass that on to the program officer. And the program official might take a look at that, and they might have 2 or 3 different panels. But let's say they have 12 recommendations now in total. They would decide which panel to then pass it on to, and then make a final recommendation to either support it or not. The reviewers, basically, if you picture providing ammo to the program officer to help sway their decision maker, their boss. So this again is a very different process, as you can see, from the NIH review process that was mentioned. So when we review for the NIH applications, they're written for the impact committee. So when we think about NIDCD, the National Institution for the Deaf and Other Communication Disorders, it's a terrible name, but that's the name of the group, and the U.S. Congress is required, actually, as the decision makers, to change that name. But the NIDCD has an advisory council called NDCD. Again, terrible names. It's worse than the acronyms we use at RIT. But the NCDC makes the final decision, the funding decision, if this application gets awarded. And they consider the review from the study sections and the overall impact score to help them make the final decision if that application gets funded. And again, when you read the review, it's really important to know that it's not written with your perspective, the applicant's perspective in mind. So it means that the reviewers they might be saying, they're told not to help the applicants to give them advice on how they should do the research. They will simply say this part of the research is weak. They might provide an example why, and it's up to the applicant to figure out how to improve their submission. So again, the review is not for the applicant. When it comes to the NSF process, the program officer, the official, makes the recommendation that has a strong influence over the final decision. But again, like was mentioned in the NIH, the program officer's perspective is not as important compared to the input and scores from the study section itself. So again, a very important distinction between NIH and NSF. And this is where we're wrapping up. And again, it's one of the most important, really beneficial things that we could do is to actually serve as a reviewer. And you would be amazed at the overall process. It would help you in how you can write grants. It will help you navigate the system and really give you a clear perspective to what goes on behind the scenes that then you can take on and incorporate yourself. We learn about common problems with the proposals. We discover proposal writing strategies that help us build a robust proposal. And we also get a chance to meet other colleagues and program officials managing those programs and have conversations with them around the topics that you're interested in. It's very important in the field that you're researching.
So for NSF panels, the first step is you would email the program officer. You'd try to identify a program within NSF that you think you have expertise that matches. You'd write to that program officer. A simple email will do. Identify yourself, introduce yourself, make a first impression. Who are you? What's your position? Where do you work? Do keep it brief in terms of explaining your experience, just sort of bullet point some of your strengths, but don't inundate them with too much information. Your email really should simply say, hello, I am so-and-so, and I would like to serve on the review panel for NSF for a specific program. I've attached my CV, and do add your CV, and also your 2-page bio sketch. Make sure to include that as well in the email and send it off. The worst thing that will happen is that they will say no, but there might be an opportunity 1 or 2 years down the road. If they're reading an application and recall your experience and are able to call you in to be a reviewer, they might do so. Now for NIH study sessions, there's a little bit of a different process to be involved. If you'd like to become a chartered member, because remember we've got those 2 different types of members, that requires an invitation from the CSR, the Center of Scientific Review. You must be a tenured faculty and be equivalent to or above an associate faculty. If you've got some research that supports that specific study session, that would be helpful to share as well. Most individuals initially start as ad hoc members. and I'm just respelling that to be clear, for their early beginnings with NIH. And then as they get to know you, you might be invited to be a chartered member. And it might be something that you're invited to one time a year, perhaps not 3, but it really will relate to, it will matter what applications they're reviewing and what expertise you bring to the table. NIH currently is trying to diversify their reviewers, their pool of reviewers. And so right now they are actively in trying to engage individuals of color to be a part of this review process. And so here you can see a link to the ECR, the Early Career Reviewer Program. So there's a link there. If you're interested, you can click it and take a look. Now, what qualifications are needed to become a reviewer for NIH? Well, that's on the next slide if we can move to that one. Go ahead and take a read really quick. So if you read this list of criterion and feel as though you would be an adequate addition to the reviewing committee, again, you can click that link that was on the previous slide and send off your information to NIH. And you would at that point be included into their database as options for reviewers. And then here's the QR code we promised at the end.
Thank you, Matt, for presenting, and everyone for coming. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you.